Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. Our subject is terrorism and what can be done to combat it. Shockingly, by far the greatest terrorist campaign in the world today is being run by the Obama administration, not by Al-Qaeda and those associated organizations that the U.S. government declared war on 12 years ago. It's part of U.S. policy that has brought war and destruction to the world, not to protect U.S. citizens, it doesn't do that, but for the profits of the tiny American economic elite, which has received 95% of the income gains in the Obama years. I'm Carl Estabrook, and it's the 11th week of 2014, a week in which the Obama administration tried to distract Americans from their own war-making, which most Americans disapprove of, by hysterical charges against Russian political moves on their borders. We'll talk about that tonight, with commentaries from Ron Zoke, Drawing the Line, Deb Johnson, Hillary and Other Barbarians at Russia's Gate, Karen Evans-Levy, just talking. That's what you said, right? And a video of a talk yesterday from Edward Snowden at the South by Southwest conference. Snowden is the American computer specialist and former employee of the CIA and the contractor for the National Security Agency who revealed massive spying on Americans and others by these government agencies. And even since Snowden's talk, we have now heard of a dispute between the Senate and the CIA about their spying on each other. So stay tuned, the story gets better. The crisis in Ukraine, promoted by the United States, points up how U.S. presidents have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings in the last 50 years, mostly civilians. The executive branch of the U.S. government has been called the world's most evil and lawless institution. Martin Luther King called the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. That's still true when the U.S. spends more on war each year, not only than Russia or China, but more than all other countries of the world combined. The U.S. has 1,000 military bases around the world in some 150 of the world's 200 countries. And President Obama, who was elected because he promised change from Bush administration war-making, has continued the war-making of his predecessors and simply lied about it because 3 out of 4 Americans are against it. The Obama administration has killed at least 4,700 individuals in numerous countries, including Pakistan, Yemen, and Somalia, with drones alone. Obama has successfully embedded the process of drone killings into the executive branch in such a way that any future president will inherit it, along with the White House kill lists and its Terror Tuesday meetings. Unbounded global war is now part of what it means to be president. And he does this not to fight terrorism, but to ensure the worldwide economic control of the American 1%. Not the interests of the U.S. people, but the interests of his corporate patrons, the 1%. But because of President Obama's intense propaganda and the shameful cooperation of the American media, most Americans don't know the extent of the war that the U.S. has brought to the rest of the world. At our recent anti-war demonstrations in Champaign and Urbana, the most frequently asked questions were, what war? And by those a bit better informed, which war? Aware, our local anti-war group, has been around for a dozen years, since the 9/11 attacks, when a number of people in Champaign-Urbana, like people in local communities around the country, saw that the U.S. government would use the 9/11 crimes as an excuse to carry on and expand its decades-long wars for control of Middle East energy resources. And our friends also saw that the traditional political parties, Democrat and Republican, would both cave in to the U.S. government's war-making strategy, which remains essentially the same whether Republicans or Democrats are in office. Today, the U.S. government is threatening, invading, occupying, and subverting countries around the world, particularly in a vast circle around the Middle East, which the U.S. military calls, revealingly enough, Central Command. This region has the world's greatest concentration of oil and natural gas, and our government is spending hundreds of billions of dollars month after month to control it. Control, and not just access to these energy resources, is what our government demanded for more than 2 generations. We, in fact, import little of our own oil supplies from the Mideast. Most of our imported oil comes from the Western Hemisphere, notably Canada and Venezuela. But control of world energy supplies gives the U.S. an unparalleled advantage over our economic rivals in Europe and Asia. These wars are not in the interests of 99% of Americans, but only the 1% who profit from armaments and oil. In other words, President Obama is killing men, women, and children in Asia and Africa in our name because China and other countries need oil, and our government intends to have control over where they get it. These wars are not in Americans' interest because it's the 1% who profit from them. President Obama's drone-driven global assassination program, by far the world's greatest terrorist campaign, is also a terror-generating campaign. The drone assassinations are one device by which state policy knowingly endangers the security of the U.S. public because of the responses, which we call terrorism, to the U.S. terrorist program around the world. The same is even more true of the shadowy and generally unknown special forces operations that the U.S. carries on in a majority of countries in the world. The Obama administration has built up what is essentially a private army, the so-called Special Operations Command, engaged in kidnapping, they call it rendition, and assassination around the world. Some 70,000 U.S. troops in SOCOM are active in some 130 countries, according to their spokesman. They report only to the President's National Security Council. These are American death squads, which, along with drones, and on the death squad thing, we heard some more just this week on the use of the School of Americas, as it was once called, in the long history of American death squads, which continues, of course, active today. These death squads, along with drones, are the Obama administration's substitute for the ground troops deployed by the Bush administration in invasion and occupation. They produce fewer American casualties, and they keep secret, in one sense, the foreign wars of which 3 out of 4 Americans disapprove. Secret, of course, not from the victims. The mission of this secret war is not fighting terrorism, but rather securing the U.S. worldwide economic empire. The Obama administration is confident that these American killers, recruited in the U.S. in the depths of the Great Recession, will not be as politically aware as their foreign counterparts often are. And we may mention that in regard to Ukraine tonight. Why is Obama carrying on this secret global assassination campaign when it's obvious that it increases terrorism around the world? We can only conclude, hard as it is to believe, that the U.S. government wants war, even including terrorist attacks against U.S. interests, as they say, and citizens. If there were no war, the U.S. would have no excuse for occupying the world's greatest energy-producing region. Obama's problem is the American people, who recently stopped him from bombing Syria and may stop him from using U.S. military action in Eastern Europe and South America. Americans don't want more war and are suffering from the administration's economic policies. But politicians, bankers, and corporations do want war, so it's clear whom Obama is working for. You're watching Aware on the Air, where we try to help frustrate the 1%'s war policy as it's put into practice by the Obama terrorism campaign. We'll begin tonight with Ron Zoke, who memorably last week revealed Victoria's Secret and the account of what the U.S. was doing in Eastern Europe. I don't know whether he's going to cry me a river tonight about that, Ron. But in any case, no. In fact, your title for tonight was Drawing the Line, which is Drawing Lines, which is exactly the issue, right?
Right. Okay, well, I'm not going to exactly draw a line in the sand and dare everyone to cross it, although that's becoming rather fashionable. Bibi Netanyahu led off with his red line, saying that Iran would not be allowed to acquire any atomic capability, whatever, apparently peaceful or military. And the U.S. had its own red line in Syria concerning the use of poison gas. And now other people are getting into the act. The latest one yesterday was an AP story. China draws red line on North Korea, says it won't allow war on the peninsula. So China is adopting the same defiant kind of attitude. Quoting the Chinese foreign minister, the Korean peninsula is right on China's doorstep. We have a red line, that is, we will not allow war or instability on the Korean peninsula, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi told reporters on the sidelines of China's annual, largely rubber-stamped parliament. Wang called upon all parties to exercise restraint, adding that, quote, genuine, lasting, and peace on the peninsula was only possible with denuclearization. So another act in this drama of everyone drawing lines. On Yahoo News, China's foreign minister on Saturday said his country would vigorously defend its sovereignty, declaring that there was no room for compromise with Japan over territory or history. We will never bully smaller countries, yet we will never accept unreasonable demands from smaller countries, Wang Yi told reporters. On issues of territory and sovereignty, China's position is firm and clear. We will not take anything that isn't ours, but we will defend every inch of territory that belongs to us. So another defiant statement. And where will this lead? Everybody being tough, talking tough anyway, and telling the world that we have a red line here and we will not allow it to be crossed, or you will face our fury. And you should be very afraid of that. So it's the same kind of propaganda line used, well, for many years by a number of political figures. Remember, Richard Nixon tried to impress everyone with the possibility that he would, if his line was crossed, he would go completely crazy and do something irrational. And they should be very afraid of that. So this whole thing has become a kind of amazing farce or drama to me. I noticed again last night in PBS's NewsHour the nonstop innuendo of the two anchors concerning what the Russians were doing in Crimea and indeed in western Ukraine. And it's amazing to me that they could really be that biased in their reporting of what's going on, but they are. And I can point out to a number of things that might be antidotes to this, but the most relevant one, I think, would be from this much maligned and despised book by Samuel Huntington, The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order. His unit of analysis is the civilization, not the nation state or the ethnic group or whatever. And he says some interesting things. This book came out in 1996, I believe. Apart from Russia, he says, the most populous and most important former Soviet republic is Ukraine. At various times in history, Ukraine has been independent, yet during most of the modern era, it has been part of a political entity governed from Moscow. The decisive event occurred in 1654, when a Cossack leader led an uprising against Polish rule, agreed to swear allegiance to the Tsar in return for help against the Poles. From then until 1991, except for a briefly independent republic from 1917 to 1920, what is now Ukraine was controlled politically from Moscow. Ukraine, however, is a cleft country with two distinct cultures. The civilizational fault line between the West and Orthodoxy runs through its heart and has done so for centuries. At times in the past, Western Ukraine was part of Poland, Lithuania, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A large portion of its population have been adherents to the Uniate Church, which practices Orthodox rites but acknowledges the authority of the Pope. Historically, Western Ukrainians have spoken Ukrainian and have been strongly nationalist in their outlook. The people of Eastern Ukraine, on the other hand, have been overwhelmingly Orthodox and have, in large part, spoken Russian. In the early 1990s, Russians made up 22%, and native Russian speakers 31% of the total Ukrainian population. A majority of the elementary and secondary school students were taught in Russian. The Crimea is overwhelmingly Russian and was part of the Russian Federation until 1954, when Khrushchev transferred it to Ukraine, ostensibly in recognition of Khmelnytsky's decision 300 years earlier. The differences between the Eastern and Western Ukraine are manifested in the attitudes of their peoples. In 1992, for example, 1/3 of the Russians in Western Ukraine, as compared with only 10% in Kiev, and they suffered from anti-Russian animosity. The East-West split was dramatically evident in the 1994 presidential elections, and it goes on with more detail about the split there, the long-standing split. The line that you can draw concerning, for example, in the political subdivisions of Ukraine, between those who voted for the pro-Russian and those who voted for pro-Western candidates. And it's a line that separates very largely Eastern Ukraine from Western Ukraine. And I think we need to develop some recognition of that and to say something realistic about what's going to happen there, rather than continuing the rhetoric about Obama not being man enough to stand up to Putin. And are they really suggesting that we start fighting the Red Army, that we start bombing Moscow, or what are they saying? And I don't know. It's very scary, and I'd like to find out what they really have in mind. Some of them have acknowledged that there's no military action possible at this point, and but we need to be more aggressive in confronting the Russians and telling them we will not stand for them crossing our line in Ukraine. And what does that amount to? A whole lot of bluster and tough talk, but this kind of posturing can lead to devastating consequences, I'm afraid, and I hope it will stop sometime soon. That's all.
Thank you very much, Ron. Important stuff there. Comments from the panel members on what Ron has just put forward? I have one quibble, at least. Yeah, okay. It's Samuel Huntington. What Ron quoted from Samuel Huntington's book is, it seems to me, is quite good. You've taken the best part there, I think, Ron. Samuel Huntington, who died a few years ago, was professor of government at Harvard. In fact, he was not just professor of government, he was professor of the science of government at Harvard. Yeah, I mean, well, exactly. Someone has what political science is to science as military music is to music. I mean, but in any case, he was professor of science and government. But the clash of civilizations, I remember quite vividly, as a matter of fact, when that book appeared in the mid-90s, and its overall impact. The year is important, because it did appear, the professor of the science of government at Harvard wrote a book immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reorganization that was taking place in the former Soviet Union. And his book was designed to give a sort of new propaganda rationale for what the U.S. was doing. What the U.S. policy actually was, this were the Clinton years after all, was not much talked about, as important political foreign policies are not talked about about in the U.S. But what the U.S. was doing with the collapse of the Soviet Union was working as vigorously as possible to reduce Russia to the status of a third world country, rather than a potential competitor in the world, a competitor that could back liberation movements, say, in the third world that the U.S. didn't want to see succeed. The fall of the Soviet Union meant that Russia could be reduced in that role, and the U.S. the Clinton administration worked vigorously to do that, to strangle the Soviet Union, and it had remarkable effects. The life expectancy of Russians went down in the 90s, in part because of the economic policy that the U.S. exerted on the now weakened Russian government. The U.S. worked hard to impose Boris Yeltsin as the leader of Russia, a man who eventually attacked the Russian parliament with tanks, to the praise of the government department at the Yale University down the street, by the way, where I was sitting at the time. The notion was that this mad drunk, which is what Yeltsin was, would further reduce the power of the Russian government to frustrate American plans around the world, and indeed he did. So in that sense, the Clinton policy was perfectly successful. Huntington, as a propagandist for American policy, American Cold War policy or post-Cold War policy in the 90s, produced this Clash of Civilizations book to explain why the rationale for American policy that had existed for years, we're stopping communism, we're fighting against worldwide communism from the end of the Second World War till 1990, till the collapse of the Soviet Union, that was the justification for the U.S. attempt to control the worldwide economy, because, after all, we're stopping the march of communism. Well, suddenly communism wasn't marching anymore, and the problem was difficult, so Huntington rushes, as a paid intellectual bodyguard for the American establishment, Huntington rushes to the fore with saying, oh, there's a new reason. We're, in fact, different civilizations, and we're clashing. And that clash is going to go on anyhow, so we just have to keep doing what we were doing. It's an incredible piece of work. It's the sort of nefarious intellectual subversion that one expects from the political scientists of American universities, and Huntington was the dean of them. Now, that said, I must say that the piece that Ron quotes about Ukraine is not inaccurate, because, of course, he has to work in the real history that he's dealing with into this fantasy of how the U.S. is a clashing civilization, and we have to find some ways to declash those other civilizations.
Well, what he really emphasizes is that within Ukraine, there's this clash of civilizations, that a line can be drawn pretty much from northeast to southwest across Ukraine, which will divide these two ethnic groups, the Ukrainian-speaking on the west, the Russian-speaking on the east, and the different religious outlooks and so on. So he doesn't really mention that for decades, for generations, Russians, Soviet and post-Soviet, have been absolutely clear that they're drawing a line about having hostile states on their border, and they will not allow that. And if someone wants to fight about it, apparently they can be rather aggressive about doing that. So I don't know. We're risking a great deal. But look at the map. Again, geopolitics is very interesting here. Ukraine is a big blob sticking in the side of Russia, and it's understandable from a more neutral point of view that the Russians, communist, non-communist, or anti-communist, don't want a hostile NATO country right there.
I think you put your finger on it, particularly with that last point,
yeah.
A hostile NATO country.
Yeah.
Remember, in the first Bush administration, Gorbachev, who was premier of the Soviet Union at the time, negotiated with the U.S. on the reunification of Germany. There were two German states, the Democratic Republic and the Bundesrepublik, the Federal Republic, the East and West Germany, as we tended to call them in American in the American press. And the press for reunification of those two, of the divided Germany, was surprisingly enough supported or allowed by Gorbachev with the proviso that this shouldn't be an occasion for the U.S. to extend its anti-Russian military alliance, which is called NATO, the North Atlantic treaty word, a long way from the North Atlantic in Germany usually, but still in all, let it ride. Gorbachev said, all right, reunification for Germany if that's what the Germans want, but only if Germany and the other Eastern European countries are not incorporated into America's worldwide military alliance called NATO. And the Bush administration said, oh, cool, we're down with that, absolutely. No NATO, we'll let Germany. And Germany, at a great expense, as a matter of fact, to German capitalism, reincorporated East Germany. Then America immediately violated its pledge to Gorbachev and extended NATO to the very borders of the Soviet Union, including Poland and Romania. And the outcome was exactly what the U.S. had promised Gorbachev wouldn't happen, that he wouldn't have a hostile military alliance on his border. Now look, in the memory of living Russians, Russia had been attacked twice across the plains of Eastern Europe by Germany. So the idea that they should say, okay, fine, reunify Germany, let's go back to the ways things were in the 19th century, I mean, that's mad. And for that very reason, Gorbachev said, fine, so long as this does not become an ally for attacking Russia again. The U.S. promised, and the U.S. reneged in the Clinton administration on that promise and incorporated all those states into NATO. So they're not jumping at shadows in Russia by any means, and it seems to me that that's one thing perhaps Huntington gets right.
Yeah. Let me. Sorry, did you want to say something?
No, go ahead.
That brings us back, or segues back into the broader topic. The reason that diplomacy doesn't work for the United States, or the reason that the United States is so bad at diplomacy, is that we say that we're going to do something and then renege on it the next movement.
We lie a lot. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's why it's either war or you're our best friends.
Yeah. So for other perspectives on this, there are recent pieces you can look up on Google between Robert Perry and called What Neocons Want from the Ukraine Crisis. They are still continuing their project of encircling Russia now and probing for points of weakness and declaring that there may be a new Cold War. Another factor is NATO is looking for a mission now. It's long been announced that NATO has lost its mission since the end of the Cold War, and so maybe they're trying to find a new one. Paul Craig Roberts, writing on the looting of Ukraine by the American oligarchs and the Ukrainian oligarchs, who seem to be split, and commanding its resources. In the West, there's a lot of agricultural of Ukraine. There's a lot of agricultural land. It's known as the breadbasket of Russia. In the East, there's a lot of heavy industry. I was surprised recently to find that there's a locomotive factory in eastern Ukraine. Who would have thought it? So it's interesting the way the split has developed and the way the fault line has developed more or less right down the middle of the Ukrainian country, which is long thought to be implausible for the very long run of Ukrainian stability.
A tiny footnote to that. The U.S. has something like 13 full-sized aircraft carriers sorted around the world. China now, all of a sudden, and for the first time in a long time, has one.
Right.
You know where they got it? They bought it secondhand from the Ukrainians.
Yeah, right.
That's true. These factories you're talking about had built an aircraft carrier. Ukraine had an aircraft carrier, you know, not exactly state-of-the-art aircraft carrier. The Chinese bought it. And the one Chinese aircraft carrier is the Ukrainian cast-off.
Yeah, the number I heard was the U.S. has 11 carrier groups which is 10 more than any other country.
Yeah, exactly. I think, well,
Carrier groups or carrier?
what's an aircraft
Yeah.
carrier or another one,
What's
other between friends?
Right, yeah.
You're watching Aware on the Air. Deb Johnson has an important piece on just the issue we're talking about here.
Well, I found this on the Black Agenda Report, and it's called Hillary and Other Assorted Barbarians at Russia's Gate. Hillary Clinton is a walking profanity and thereby a prime candidate to be the next president of the United States.
This is Glenn Ford writing this,
Glenn
right?
Ford, yes
Yeah.
it is.
Not us, right?
The fiend who played
Yeah.
Julius Caesar when U.S. employed jihadists butchered Libya Muhammad Gaddafi. We came, we saw, he died.
Yeah.
Now likens Russia's response to the U.S.-backed fascist putsch in the Ukraine to Hitler's quest for a greater Germany. It is like spitting on the graves of the 25 million Russians and other Soviet nationalities slaughtered in Hitler's racist jihad, the people who actually defeated the Nazis while the U.S. and Britain loitered off Europe's shores. At war's end, the United States imported thousands of Nazis to construct the nuclear, chemical, biological, military juggernaut that would usher in an American century while confiscating Paul Robeson and W.E.B. Du Bois passports. Thanks to the Americans, West Germany denazification never happened, but by the mid-70s, Washington had implanted fascist military regimes throughout Latin America, one of which exterminated 200,000 Guatemalan Mayas. When John Kerry praises the brave Ukrainians that took to the streets to stand against tyranny and demand democracy, he makes common cause with the direct political heirs of the Ukrainian Waffen SS units and concentration camp guards that eagerly joined Hitler's genocidal rampage in the mid-20th century. The Ukrainian fascists, who command 40% of the electorate in some western regions of the country, returned the compliment, hoisting the Confederate flag in Kiev City Hall. They see correctly that the epicenter of their ideology is not Berlin, but Washington. The transatlantic affinity is more fundamental and deep-rooted than the $5 billion that Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland brags the U.S. has invested in the developing democratic institutions in Ukraine, resulting in the overflow of the elected government and its replacement by ethnic-based mob rule. This is the model that held sway in the southern United States for nearly a century. Following the death of Reconstruction, ethnic purity was the organizing principle of one-party democratic rule in Dixie from the mid-1870s to the mid-1960s. Race and nation were one, ordained by God, science and history, obligating every white man to break and burn the bodies of all Negroes, mongrels, and race-mixing whites that might challenge the political order. Mob rule, lynch law, buttressed the political provided a template for future fascists. The apartheid order in Dixie predates the establishment of fascist regimes in Europe, and in terms of its racial component has more in common with the Nazi strain than Mussolini's Italy. The ideological unity of the white South empowered democratic fascists to exercise outsized influence over the national government. The Dixie-born Ku Klux Klan became a national phenomenon, and the emerging U.S. empire swaggered about the globe with a decidedly Southern accent. Pre-Civil War white Southern dreams of building a slave empire throughout the Americas meshed nicely with Teddy Roosevelt's imperial ambitions. I lost my place. hold on. Here we are.
I have the text here if you
All
would,
right, hold on a minute.
Okay.
I'd lost it. Building a slave empire throughout the Americas meshed nicely with Teddy Roosevelt's imperial ambitions. Sorry, guys. Shortly after the turn of the 20th century, Roosevelt violated all the rules of naval warfare in favor of racial pageantry, painting U.S. naval vessels white for a world tour of the Great White Fleet. Both Europe and the non-white world understood his meaning. When the Black Freedom Movement forced a split in the National Democratic Party in the early 60s, Southern whites bolted to the Republicans, transforming the party of Lincoln into the National White Man's Party. When Dixie, the bedrock of Republican electoral college strength, the coded language of race came to dominate general U.S. political discourse. In a very real sense, Americans sound like Southern white fascists, with their reflective assumptions of supremacy, global privilege, and ordained national mission, including lots of Black Americans. After all, the fascist order of the pre-60s Solid South was simply a domestic expression of U.S. manifest destiny, the national religion. I believe that's it. Oh, no, here we go. Fascists all over the world, not just Ukraine. No, they have tens of millions of soulmates in the United States, including the leadership of both major parties. That's why they flashed the white supremacist gang sign from Kiev. In turn, the American political class and corporate media prove they are also fascists by pretending that the Ukrainian allies are Democrats. With the U.S. and NATO now poised at Russia's door, as was Germany in 1941, Hillary Clinton attempts to flip the clear historical parallel by ranting that it is President Putin who seeks a greater Russia. The Kremlin has every reason to believe the barbarians are at the gate.
Thank you, Deb. That is an important piece. Glenn Ford's comments have for a long time been the one of the best ways to find out about what actually is going on in the American political mythology, I think. Comments on Deb's observations?
Well, it's highly colorful, a little more lurid than I would favor, but yeah, there's an important point, I think.
Color is one of the things on his mind, yes.
Yeah, embedded in there somewhere, but I can't dig it out at the moment.
The parallel that he works on between the post-Civil War white South and the rise of fascism, and particularly Nazism, as he says, in Germany, that parallel is resisted. Certainly it was resisted by in the Virginia of my youth and in the American political mythology for a long time. But there are some telling connections. At the Nuremberg trials after World War II, the German leadership was tried by an international court for launching an aggressive war and for crimes against humanity. And one of the crimes against humanity that was alleged was the vast eugenics program that the Nazis put into place, a program of forced sterilization of people who were mentally defective or of the wrong racial background or some. I mean, they did not, in fact, instance the concentration camps. They instanced the programs before the war, in which the German government after 1933 produced a program of forced sterilizations and so forth for the wrong sort of people. In their defense, the German leaders said, wait a minute, our program came from the United States. We were simply putting into practice what had been put into practice by American states, including my home state of Virginia, and approved by the Supreme Court. They were referring specifically to the classic Oliver Wendell Holmes opinion in the case called Buck v. Bell, which provided for the involuntary sterilization of a woman, black as it happened, who was mentally defective, according to the medical reports. the, the, the German defense, the defense of the Nazi leaders, was on this point correct. That is, indeed, it had been the United States that had pioneered the eugenics programs that the Germans had adopted under the Nazi government. So it's a connection. The connection that Glenn Ford talks about here between what he calls expansively, as Ron says, American fascism and the fascism of the 20th century in Europe, down to the fascism in the 21st century in Europe, the connection is indeed there. We can quibble. In fact, it might be worthwhile to have a serious discussion about precisely what we mean by fascism. But the connection with these political movements that Ford talks about is not to be denied. That's what's happening, and it's an aspect of the politics that the U.S. is employing in its attempt to check Russia in Eastern Europe.
Apart from the eugenic question, there was the heightened racial consciousness in this country going back to the early 1920s, resulting in the immigration legislation of 1924, I think it was, where certain groups were largely excluded, and there was a whole lot of that in the air at the time, before the Nazis came along.
That's a very good point, and it's also important to realize that that's not a straight line history in America. Sometimes when we think about American history and the history of slavery, the history of racism, we think that, well, of course, there was slavery in America up until 1865 when the Civil War ended, and then after 1865 there was sort of a holdover or a hangover of racist attitudes towards former slaves, and thankfully that now has been diluted and put aside in our time. Well, there are a lot of things wrong with that account, and one is the notion that it's a sort of straight line development from 1865 to 2014. The racism in the sense of institutional discrimination against black people was not the case in post-Civil War American government, in the most post-Civil War federal government, down to the administration of the Democrat who got us into the First World War. It was Woodrow Wilson's administration that resegregated the armed forces and reestablished formal racism, that is, legal discrimination against people of color, in the American federal government. That was 1916 and following. Wilson had been elected president first in 1912. So it was the 20th century history of the increase in formal racism, if you want to put it that way, racism by law, for which Woodrow Wilson, the great liberal president, was responsible. There's a history of these things that has, in many cases, gone down the memory hole, and we say, aha, we've just got away from the bad old days when the United States was racist. You're watching Aware on the Air, and one of the themes that's emerged in our discussion today, I think, is the connection of race and politics worldwide, and the implications of that for the sorts of politics that the U.S. is following, prosecuting covertly and overtly in Europe right now vis-a-vis Russia. It's not limited to that. There are parallels throughout the world. American foreign policy is like rust. It never sleeps, and indeed it works around the world. Deb, you wanted to mention specifically some a Latin American aspect of this these days, right?
Yes. There's a new president elected in Chile, and actually she was president in Chile before. Her name is Michelle Bachelet, I believe,
yeah.
a socialist.
Right.
And she basically is very anti Chicago School of Economics. She's like, you know, very, very against what Augusto Pinochet and that economic program brought to their country prior. And she's back. She's president again.
it was pointed out on the anniversary that for all we talk about 9/11 in this country and mean 9/11
And actually,
2001.
not to interrupt, but Grover Cleveland was actually a president that was elected twice. Is that correct?
Grover
says
Cleveland was elected twice, yes.
Bachelot gets the rare opportunity to be president twice at 2 different times. Something
I
that
see what
only
you mean, yes.
one
That's right.
American,
Uh-huh.
Grover
Yeah.
Cleveland, has ever been able to do.
There's a wonderful limerick, a double dactyl, about Cleveland in that regard, and unfortunately, the ravages of age are such that I don't remember it. But I'll bring it up.
The fact that
I'll
you
bring it down
remember
straight.
that there was one was
That's right.
pretty
Well,
good.
I'll put it on the Facebook page. By the way, I should mention that a number of the things that we talk about here on Aware on the Air turn up in more detail on our Facebook page. We use that more than we use the website of Aware or a blog these days. So a lot of the comments, if you wanted further information about them or support or another excoriation of Samuel Huntington's memory or something, look to our Facebook page where members of Aware and friends post things on the issues of interest to the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana.
Which reminds me, a lot of people have asked to become members on the Aware Facebook page, and I just haven't gotten to the point where I will give you permission to write.
Oh, good.
Yes.
Good. I'm glad. That's
I'm a little bit
important.
behind on it. I noticed that the other day.
Okay. While we're talking about Aware as an institution, unfortunately, it's an institution of 12 years standing here in Champaign-Urbana. If the U.S. were not carrying on war around the world, would be no need for organizations of citizens like Aware, and there are organizations like it across the country that have a good deal more political force than may be noticed by the American media. The administration knows it. The administration is very much scared of those organizations. The administration is scared of us, as it should be, most recently because it was organizations like this that stopped the Obama administration from killing more people in Syria. And the administration is quite worried about what the popular understanding will mean for its attempt to kill people around the world. It's a realized or a successful attempt to kill people around the world in the global assassination campaign. So these questions are live questions. It's only Obama's victims who
You
are
think
dead.
Aware is an organization? Wow.
The notion that it's an organization at all. A fantasized organization, perhaps, but we need more. If so, we need more of that fantasy.
Can we go back
Perhaps-
to the conversation about fascism?
Sure. I'm afraid we have to. Yeah.
One of the reasons I want to do that is because I'm going to go meet a friend very soon who is very afraid that of fascism happening in the United States. And so she is convinced that if we don't continue to elect the people like Hillary Clinton, like as you mentioned earlier, to become president, then fascism will come to the United States. So I didn't live through the period of where fascism was like the major fear, and also, anyway, go ahead. What do you think about? What do you think people think fascism
Well, personally,
is?
I think it's already here. I think it's already here.
There are many books trying to explain the nature of fascism, trying to find common elements in what happened in Germany and Italy and Spain and France to some extent.
And the
so
United
on.
States.
Yeah. And there's no single definition or characterization that will satisfy everyone. But I think we can kind of identify some of the field marks of fascism, kind of extreme nationalism, the stigmatizing some single group, minority group, as the cause of all of our troubles, and concentration on one single charismatic great leader, and so on. And all of these, I think, are trouble spots that could lead to fascism. But as for identifying its essence, I can't do that.
I think the point here might be to shift your friend's concern from fascism, which, as Ron, I think, rightly says, is difficult to describe. In fact, the three characteristics he offers, I suggest, don't fit our classic examples of fascism in Italy and Spain. But let that be. I think the question is the fear of fascism that your friend is concerned about, and that indeed has been important. The fear of what the Republicans might do got Barack Obama reelected, not an account of what he did. And it seems to me that question of fear is a perennial in American politics. The notion that someone is going to come get us, that something nasty is going to happen unless we find someone to protect us. Stick close to nurse for fear of something worse was the way British people of an earlier generation put it. That's a perennial in American politics. And there are people who suggest that there's a good reason for that, that any country based as, any society based as the U.S. is on two of the greatest crimes in history, I'm referring specifically to the extinction of the Native American and the enslavement of the Native African, any society based on two of the greatest crimes in history has reason to be afraid. Afraid of its victims, afraid that in some sense there's too much bad karma out there, and what goes around comes around, you know.
That
It's
there'll be an
certainly true.
uprising? Or
Pardon?
that there'll be an uprising of the people that we've oppressed?
That was literally the fear of the first European settlers in this country. What they were most afraid of were the natives who were being dispossessed. You can read what the first European residents of Massachusetts said about what their major problems were. It's quite instructive because it doesn't go away. And then, of course, we all know that the history of the American 19th century and before was a history of the great fear of slave uprisings in the American South, and what we don't often mention, because they won, were the fear in the North of worker uprisings. The fact that the poor Irish were in arguably worse conditions in New York than slaves in Atlanta meant that the great fear of the American upper class continued in new forms in the 19th century. And I want to suggest that it continues well through the 20th century to today. The fear of communism, which was the basis of American popular politics through the latter half of the 20th century, gave way with the disappearance of communism, although, listen to some of those neocons, you know, it's still there, it never went away. And that's why I said, for example, that it was necessary for people like Samuel Huntington to find a new enemy, something else we can be afraid of. And I think fascism, in this sense, takes the role, you know, of Muslim terrorists. There's a vast number of Americans who are convinced that Islam is about to make inroads into American society, and they will be subjected to Sharia law.
Well,
now,
and that's
astonishing.
Why,
that's just
why
astonishing.
The whole 9/11 thing. That, you know, I'm a very staunch supporter of 9/11 truth because of that fact. You know, it was like you know, Muslims were the new thing to be afraid of, and that's what 9/11 really brought forth in this country, which to me is just unforgivable. But I wanted to mention corporation takeover, you know, as far as lobbying our, you know, senators and House of Representatives, you know, the joke being that they should all wear jackets and have insignias of all the corporations who are funding their election. So,
like the NASCAR
we
cars.
did that in our campaign 12 years ago.
Yeah.
well, listen, you know, it probably needs, you know, there'd be more patches this time, right? But I mean, isn't that a sign of fascism when corporations, multinational corporations, are running policy in Washington? And, you know, the workers that work for these corporations are really, you know, losing benefits and you know, insurance and everything else because they're trying to cut corners and they're not really promoting the American worker at all. They don't pay taxes. I mean, the list is, you know, that's why I honestly believe that fascism is already here. we're living it. We're living it.
Well, another aspect is emphasizing the supposed organic unity of the state. So these other groups should subordinate their complaints to national unity and the great leader.
And it seems to me that there are few questions more important than trying to sort these things out for American citizens today. Thomas Pynchon writes in his wonderful and important, politically important novel, Gravity's Rainbow, if you can get them asking the wrong questions, you don't have to worry about answers. And it seems to me that, saving your presence, Deb, some of the talk about 9/11 is an example of getting on to the wrong questions, whereas the things you raise about American corporate rule, the rule of the American 1%, that's getting on to the right questions. Whether you want to call that oligopoly or fascism or what have you, so long as you define your terms, you're free to play, so to speak. And it might be worthwhile for us to try to define some of those terms precisely because it will make us think about the history and the circumstances that brought us to where we are right now, what the actual situation is we're in, and what we should be afraid of. There's much to do there.
Well, just real briefly, there was an article about the CIA caught spying on the U.S. Senate.
Oh, yes,
And
the
one of
big story
real
of the
tiny
day,
paragraph,
and we're just mentioning it now.
I don't want to really get into it because we don't have time, but the one little paragraph that I thought was profound was the revelations of CIA spying on Congress underscore the fact that America is run by an unelected, unaccountable military/intelligence apparatus. It is this apparatus in conjunction with the corporate financial elite that dictates official policy in Washington, irrespective of which political party is in power. And I think that's really important. This came off the World Socialist website, an article that came out yesterday.
Truth.
Okay.
Truth.
Before we stop, we should mention that we'll be at Lincoln Square Saturday morning, the 15th, next Saturday.
8 o'clock sharp.
Yep, the Ides of March. So if you like or especially dislike any of the stuff, come and talk to us.
A very good
Buy
point.
some bumper stickers.
All right.
Thanks to our director and producers, Jason and Yosef. Thanks to those also thanks to them also. This program will be available on YouTube. We want to remind you of other programs like ours here on UPTV, now streaming online at UrbanaPublicTelevision.org. Democracy Now! Every weekday morning at 7, The Big Picture weekdays at 8, and Democracy Now! Repeated at 5 p.m. Now, if you object to the Obama administration's conducting illegal and unjustified war and lying about the reasons for it, join us. Aware meets every Sunday evening, 5 to 6 p.m. at the White Horse Inn on John Street in Champaign, near the IUC campus.
He's saying 2 minutes. I'm just letting you know without trying to interrupt. Sorry. Keep going.
And I might say also that members and friends of Aware are also invited to sit in on this panel and participate in this program, Aware on the Air. We record at noon on Tuesdays in the Urbana City building. We occasionally let the Urbana City Council use our studio during the week. But finally...
we won't have an Aware on the Air next week.
Thank you very much. They will be using it at this hour or on Tuesday of next week because there's a primary election.
Yes,
the
vote.
Major political parties, as they like to style themselves, are having elections next week, and they'd like you to come, of course, because they'd like to keep the mythology going. But in any case, we won't be here. So, inshallah, we'll be back the following week. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Deborah Johnson, Ron Zoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, other members and friends of Aware. All these people have the same name. Why did that happen? Saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow,
We're very close.
good night and good luck.